Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so picking up with DCeased Part 3, this one's actually kind of sad. We talked about this in our Injustice videos, right? And we even talked about it in the first video or so of DCeased, that when it comes to Tom Taylor as a writer, while his stories can be exceedingly dark, Tom Taylor is very, very good at drawing out the human element of characters. It's one of the reasons why I love Alex Ross art so much, to kind of go off on a tangent for a second. You look at like the Alex Ross drawing of like the Justice League or like the JSA or something like that, and it almost makes you nostalgic for an era of comics that none of us were really part of, when like there were good guys and bad guys and like that was it. But it was more like the people behind the characters. It's why the world's greatest superheroes, I think, is the greatest comic book miniseries of all time. And this picks up essentially with Alfred just kind of saying his goodbyes to some of the Bat family, right? So to like Tim Drake and to Batman and to Dick Grayson, because all three of them are dead. And whenever we read stories like this, when characters die, you know, depending on how attached we are, there's always like that one part of us that kind of wishes they were still there, right? Like that kind of holds out hope that like they'll come back, you know. And it's kind of interesting because it's like, okay, well, maybe we missed something. Maybe they're not really dead. You know, maybe they're just like recovering, or like Batman's healing or something, but like something has to happen that they come back. And Tom Taylor just kind of seems to put out this indication of like, no, they're gone. Alfred basically takes, you know, the Batwing and like leaves. But the cool thing about this, and one of the reasons why I like that so much, is because this puts off the indication, and it really shows how bleak things are, that like heroes are dying left and right and they're not coming back. And it's kind of the cool thing, because while this is only really 6 issues long, just from what I've seen so far, I feel like it could be longer. I mean, anything more than 9, I think it would stretch on too much. But from what we saw with like, what is it, Batman the White Knight, like 6-issue miniseries can lead into something better, which is what we're getting, right? We're getting a sequel to the White Knight. This looks really, really awesome. And so switching over to Harley Quinn, like it's kind of a bit of a moment for her, right? I mean, when it comes to Harley and DC Comics, this is one of the things that I've always kind of struggled with her characters. When it comes to Harley and DC Comics, when she first popped up, she was basically kind of a holdover from Batman the Animated Series, right? That's where she originally appeared. That's where she got her debut. And there wasn't really a whole lot of development there. It wasn't until a few years went by that DC started finally focusing and building on Harley. And then of course later on added her to the Suicide Squad and different things like that. But the idea behind this is that her character has always for a long time sort of existed under the shadow of the Joker. That's what she was best known for. But for her character inside the comics, she's under the shadow of Joker, right? Like he's the guy who taunts her, he's the guy that makes her life a living hell, and the guy she always goes back to. And so where she's always kind of tried to make an escape, in this one, we get a kind of finality here, right? I mean, the Joker is zombified, right? I mean, he's a zombified version of the Joker. He's a zombie. Harley Quinn like grabs a shotgun and like blows him in half, right? Just like shoots him and kills him, or at least, you know, seems to kill him. Now, one of the things that hasn't really been established here by Tom Taylor, at least not outright specifically, is that if a person is kind of turned into one of these quote unquote zombies, which he's kind of said they're not really zombies, but they basically are. If a person's turned into a zombie and then in turn like they are killed by traditional means, can they come back? And I don't think that's explicitly been stated yet, right? I mean, a person can be turned into a zombie, but there's no indication they can actually come back from that if they've been killed. But still, like at the moment right now, the Joker's just kind of shot and killed, and that seems to be the end of that. And then Harley's met by the birds of prey, right? So like Huntress and Catwoman and Batwoman and Batgirl. So basically like a majority of the superhero community are now being turned into these zombie things. And that's why I say it's so cool. It's because everybody's back really seems to be up against the wall. It's the end times, right? Like things are falling apart. It almost kind of seems like a fast-tracked version of Injustice, right? I mean, Injustice, you know, things pop off, the Joker kills, or really tricks Superman into killing Lois and their unborn child. A bomb gets blown up, or, you know, is detonated and wipes out Metropolis. And then over the course of like an entire year, or really 2 years, depending on how you want to look at it, Superman goes from like this guy who was a superhero to like a full-on villain. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because you look at that and it's like fast-tracked, right? It's like things are falling apart, things are basically breaking apart exceedingly fast, but it works because if this were to happen, and if some kind of zombie plague were to manifest and be spread through digital information, then it would happen this fast, right? I mean, as often as people are on their phones, surfing the web, looking at YouTube videos, different things like that, people are constantly wired in and connected. And so if there were some kind of digital virus that could convert people into like these monstrous zombie things, it would happen like that. The world would be conquered within a day and a half. Only rural villages and towns would be the ones who would be the last affected, because they're really more disconnected than like major metropolitan areas. But again, it's a cool thing. And so switching over to Damian, this is a part of him that we usually never get to see. When you have Damian, like he's basically facing the fact that like his father's dead. And for Damian Wayne, historically speaking as a character, he's almost seemed disconnected from his own humanity, right? I mean, he was basically conceived by Talia al Ghul in basically like a pretty screwed up scenario with Batman. And then in turn, like raised among the League of Assassins, and then basically taught to be like this prodigious killer, right? Like the human human element was never really part of it. He was just taught to kill. And it wasn't until he was brought to Batman and raised by Bruce that Bruce tried to instill that human element in him, right? It's the nature of the progression of his character, going from what was essentially a killing machine to becoming a killing machine who's also human. And so because of that, because we never really get to see this kind of moment in him, it's actually pretty touching, because Jonathan sits down with him, and where Damian Wayne doesn't want to talk, Jonathan's response is, okay, well then I'll go ahead and just sit here so that you don't have to be alone. It's a very important thing. And on the surface, it kind of seems like, okay, well that's interesting. But this is probably one of the most important displays of friendship that Jonathan's ever shown to Damian. And the reason why is because sometimes it's not all about just being there and like giving the right answers all the time and saying everything you need to say to just make a person feel better. Sometimes it's just being there. Like, the knowledge of you being there is enough, and that's all they need. All they need is to know that you're there, and that's it. That's the only comfort they need. Everything else they can deal with internally, and when the time comes when they're ready to talk, they will. It's a very important life lesson that I think not enough people learn. Being there is important. That's the most important thing. So again, you have Superman and you have Lois, who actually stay hands off. The same thing with Oliver Queen and with Dinah Lance. They kind of stay hands off, and they're like, we'll just leave them there, and we'll just let them be friends, and whatever happens, happens. It's a really, really cool moment. But Superman's response is also kind of focusing on other things, because he kind of keeps mulling over him to himself, how Damian's feeling. Damian just lost his dad, and then it clicks. Superman's response is, I have to go home. I have to go to Smallville. And initially it's kind of like, okay, Lois is like, okay, I understand you have to do that, but Superman is kind of like, okay, what we need to do is create a safe space for you guys. And this is one of the coolest moments in the story, because when this happens, Superman uses his X-ray vision. He looks throughout the entirety of the Daily Planet, and he has to differentiate between who's infected and who's not. And what he says here is that those who are infected cannot be brought back. And so he has to stop looking at them like they're human beings and look at them strictly as the enemy. And that's a crushing thing for Superman to have to do, right? Because he's the guy who always sees the best in things, who always sees hope. Superman embodies hope. And to suddenly thrust himself into a position where he has to look at people and say there is no hope is devastating. There are people he's worked with for years. Jimmy Olsen, like Perry White, they're family. And so with that being the case, it's literally him having to eliminate his own family members because there's no way to save them. It's an absolutely devastating role to have to take on. The hardest part of this whole situation is separating himself from his own humanity. It's the hardest thing to do. And it's so cool to see it done that way, right? I mean, it's things like this, these kind of cool, introspective, deconstructive stories with Superman in them that make him more interesting, right? I mean, because Superman, he's the original superhero. He flies, he punches. That's not interesting. What makes it interesting is when you focus on him as a character in these scenarios where he has to kind of cast aside everything he's known and become something different, even if only for a brief amount of time. And so it's a cool little moment here, because then you switch over to Atlantis, and you've got Mara, and then you've got Garth learning how to use his powers as Tempest, or at least controlling them in a more finite level, and Mara being the one to teach him, right? But remember, Atlantis is for the most part isolated from the surface world. And aside from Aquaman, realizing that like the surface is going to pot and we haven't seen what he's been doing, nobody else in Atlantis knows what's going on. There's no reason for them to be concerned. But it's suddenly in the midst of all this, the water starts turning dark. And for me, it was kind of confusing for a second. I was like, why in the world is the water turning dark? Like, and it was kind of wild, because when that happened, like, you literally find out that what Aquaman's been doing is attacking and killing everyone. Not only that, like, Aquaman presumably has been attacking like animals, sharks and things like that, because they're now consuming people. Either that, or Aquaman is sending out like subtle commands to the sharks saying like, kill everyone. So like, it could be one or the other, but literally like, this is all just blood in the water. And that's what Mara says, like, stay away from the blood. Like, do not make contact with the blood. But for Garth, it's too late. And so with Mara using her powers to essentially control water, she makes her escape. And it's actually kind of a cool little thing, because what she could do here is create a kind of safe pocket around herself everywhere she goes. But remember, Mara's powers can be mentally exhausting. She's going to have to make her way to the surface. She's going to have to seek out what's left of the superheroes. But when she gets to the surface, then she's going to realize how dire things are, that the world is essentially over. And so it's kind of cool, because with Superman making his way, one of the things he says is like for him as a hero, his job is to be there for as many people as he can. But the problem he faces right now is that like everyone needs him. And so of course he comes across Black Lightning, he comes across Jefferson Pierce. Jefferson Pierce is actually kind of cool. You never really see him that much in like these crossover events. I mean, I think he's more pronounced now than he has been before, because he's got his own show. With Jefferson Pierce, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a combination of like innate abilities, not really innate abilities, but like abilities unto himself, as well as using like some kind of magic and mysticism to create like Black Lightning. But still, it's kind of cool with this whole thing, because when he shows up, like, it's basically him fighting Clayface, because Clayface is infected and is like turning into like this giant tentacle monster, like attacking everything in sight. We only see Jefferson Pierce for a short amount of time, but it is kind of cool, because you get to see that like, hey, look, there's some guys here. One of the things that I dig about this is that this almost kind of feels like a movie. It's an interesting little scenario. But when he gets back home to Smallville, of course, he's met by his mother Martha, and she's like, your father's inside. I hit him over the head. Something's wrong with him. And then of course, when Superman gets in there, it turns out that his father's infected. Now, this kind of makes sense. The idea of Jonathan Kent dying, it's part and parcel to his character, right? I mean, it's what happens with him. And so when you have this scenario unfold where like Superman gets home and like his father's infected, it's one of the most touching moments in the story, because usually whenever Jonathan Kent died, it was circumstances outside of Superman's control, right? Like either he wasn't there or it was something that he couldn't have helped, whatever the case was, whether it was in like the Man of Steel movie where he gets whisked away by a tornado, and which of course is a result of him making one of the dumbest decisions ever. Like, hey son, like rescue them and then rescue me because you're super fast and you could easily do it. No, just stay there and don't save me because the world doesn't need to know you exist. Okay, I'm pretty sure that if Superman was like, hey look guys, I really had to do this, I had to rescue my dad, please just don't tell anybody who I am, that they would be like, yeah man, we understand dude, like it's cool. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't run off to the papers and say, hey man, there's this guy who can fly in like Smallville, you guys should definitely write a report about him. It was clearly like terrible writing on behalf of Zack Snyder, which is what he usually does, but nonetheless, like his father normally dies, right? And so like in those circumstances where it's outside Superman's control, in this circumstance it is. Like Superman literally has to put his humanity aside in the most extreme scenario ever and say, okay, like my father's here, I'm going to leave him here. You would expect, like what I would have expected is that he would have killed him. I know a lot of people would have disagreed with that, and a lot of people would have said, no, that's dumb, that's stupid, you know, yada yada yada, so on and so forth. I think it would have been awesome because it would have been really one of these moments that really kind of doesn't really snap Superman, but really shows how dire things are, that Superman has to kill his own pops. But leaving Smallville and leaving him there, it kind of, you know, leaving him confined down in there, unless he has the strength to break out, which he doesn't. Superman basically sealed it closed with his heat vision. It kind of works, because assuming that he didn't find a way out, then he would just be kind of stuck down there forever. But if he did find a way out, well then there goes Smallville. Like everybody in Smallville is going to be infected. So potentially Superman's doomed his entire hometown, assuming they weren't really dead already. But it's kind of a cool thing, and it's a cool moment. Like the story's awesome, and I think it's a lot better than people are giving it credit for. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.